Hello and welcome to my comments on your Google Hangout 3 by Paulette, Jesse, Michael, Kacey, and Jackson in absentia. And so Jesse and Paulette, thank you for filling in on those questions that Jackson had a responsibility to do. I appreciate you came in and helped him out. So he had technical difficulties. I was very happy to see that he is finally in person materialized on Google Hangout 4. So Google Hangout 3 was all about preparedness and community resilience building. And Paulette started by launching the question number 1 on general apathy and lack of preparedness, societal preparedness to disasters. So you discussed some of the factors that were cited in literature. Some of the public ones, and you broke it down into public and governmental. So on the public side, you talked about people's general lack of apathy and blowing preparedness off. And I don't know if I shared with you, but the recent study by FEMA for the Office of Preparedness yielded the results of a survey that confirmed previous research that approximately 16% of surveyed agencies, communities, institutions reported that preparedness was on the radar. 53 that it was not even remotely on the radar. So you have, again, confirming studies that nearly half of the survey did not really treat preparedness as a priority, with only less than 20% taking it to heart. So you've got that, stronger recent confirmation that our preparedness efforts still seem to be yielding similar results. 1 in 5 people preparing. Underestimation of risk has been cited as one of the culprits for lack of preparedness. And you mentioned that even for people that live in risk-prone areas, such as in Tornado Alley, still very few of them would have adjustments for those type of events, such as storm cellars. And certainly, if you had ever considered buying or researching a market for storm cellars, those things are extremely expensive. So when you're taking into account that people that live in those areas might be already in areas that are of a lower income housing, adjustments such as storm shelters might not be financially feasible as an investment. And so again, we're going back to those socioeconomic factors or community vulnerability or social vulnerability factors. There is no correlation between the preparedness and actual risk. You mentioned that people do not want to see it for what it is. For example, in spite of the abandoned research, people tend to, you mentioned Arizona, people tend to underestimate the threat of floods in that area. Kacey talked about the time when she lived in Arizona, and there were, you lived through storms and power outages and, really scary times. But yet people tend to underestimate the actual risks of those events occurring. Jesse was talking about the general acceptance of potential losses in disasters. So people think that, que sera, sera, what's going to be is going to be. They're going to deal with it when they get to it. And part of it, discussed in the literature is that, you do have everyday life events every day. So planning and preparedness is really not on people's minds when they have to worry about putting gas in the car and going to work, or working 3 jobs, or having all kinds of different priorities during the blue sky. And when you have a good weather most of the year, I think that was Jesse's example, then you accept, then, if you do have every now and then bad weather, then you're going to deal with it as it comes. Over-reliance on technology, I think Paulette had a discussion on that, we rely on seawalls and levees and have that sense of invulnerability that those constructions and structures that have been put in place will protect us. And of course, you mentioned about the Galveston storm that raised the storm that was 2 feet higher than the taller structure in the city, and also there is the even after the earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco and the fire, they still it took a while to enforce those seismic research and earthquake codes. So it took us almost to the 30s in California to have some kind of legislation on earthquake. So even the earthquake in 1906 was not the impetus enough for them to think about rebuilding differently or mitigating. And also, you mentioned the social pressures. So, the people that stay and they weather the disaster, they develop special subculture. We talked about subcultures or ethos and their bragging rights, that they've been there and they've done that. And that social pressure trickles down on newcomers and people that are moving to the areas and affects how they perceived that risk in that community. So it's no longer a very realistic risk, but it's conflated through the perception of another social group that's already experienced the event. I think Michael brought back Thomas Drabek into the discussion and on the human side of a disaster, and talked about the invincibility, people talking about a study that they performed in Florida, I believe. So then you were talking about the lobbyists, and coalitions usually don't have enough push or enough money to push their regulations or legislation. And part of it is also has to do with political forces. Obviously, there is always disaster politics. And if you consider that elected officials get elected for certain terms, it's very difficult to have a strategic view of something. So the policy tends to be touch and go, and different political agendas will affect how those different projects continue or not continue, preparedness projects. So again, that's at the governmental, you move from public to government. And so it's difficult to have a strategic visioning if you have changes in those different policymaker structures. So the other thing that you talked about, some of the things to keep in mind, routine emergency measures, and focusing on you deal with those. Ambiguity, who needs to do what, so resolving ambiguity for preparedness. Researchers and probabilities. So again, in complexity and uncertainty, research is not readily available. So people have a very hard time knowing what specifically to plan for. So if you get a checklist and you are told that if you plan for this, this, and that, and you are done, then there's stronger likelihood that people will prepare. But when you're dealing with uncertainties and things can change and no disaster will ever be the same, then that also creates apathy or fatalism, because it's very difficult to know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. You talked about some other factors that affect preparedness from research have been in gender studies, that women tend to prepare more than men. Generally, within risk literature, women, there are gender differences in risk aversion. So women tend to be more risk averse than men. So men are more of the risk takers in some of the studies. And also, not only gender differences, but households that have children tend to prepare a little bit more, even though those level of preparedness are still very low. So at some point, Paulette moved to question 2. So I'm just going to sort of look over what I've got in my notes. So you talked about strategies, effective preparedness strategies, and you mentioned that they have to be cost effective, getting to the right people in the right areas. So they cannot be those really large, get a kit type of messages that they should be very targeted for certain communities or certain populations. Preparing to scale or on a smaller scale, and then change it, expand the preparedness level. So building on preparedness incrementally, because having those really large initiatives, again, they might not be applicable. And something that I think about when I think about make a kit and be prepared is that issue of batteries and radios. So how many of you actually have a radio that takes batteries? I don't anymore. So, a lot of us are relying on different technologies nowadays. So, and then there are different age groups, right? So the elderly are most likely not going to use the same technology that the millennials would. Some of the elderly still have landlines in their homes. So the text messaging or things like that might not be a very effective strategy for them, preparedness strategy for that particular group. Some other factors that affect preparedness is proximity in time to the disaster. So obviously the interest is proportional to how much time has elapsed. When those events moved, are withdrawn in time, then our collective memory of the event is not as strong, and that impetus for preparedness is lower. And there's another thing that goes with that you also discussed, is that when you have greater mobility of people, as people change the communities, if communities change now much faster than they used to. And so there is, between one census and the next, there can be tremendous differences in the community profile. So case in point, in River Plantation, where I live, that community was built around oil industry from Houston, who built their summer residences on the outskirts in suburbia, and that's sort of how it started in the 70s, late 60s, early 70s. In 2001, the community had a tremendous disaster from Tropical Storm Allison, and in the process, a lot of homes were lost. FEMA was doing massive buyouts and so on and so forth. And then until the Tax Day, Memorial Day, and later Harvey combo, so to speak, the three, once in 100-year floods that happened, there was a relative period of nothing, smaller floodings, localized flooding. So a lot of new residents to the area, like myself, if they are not aware of that particular event in a community, they don't remember it collectively as a community. They were not there. And it's not something that's talked about generally, unless something happens, right? So it's not something that the real estate agency is going to advertise that this is a community that had a tremendous flooding in 2001. So people that purchase those homes, they purchase homes that they might not be aware that they flooded 7 times in the past. And then, of course, there are no oil industry people moving into that area anymore. The demographics are totally different. There's a lot more linguistic diversity. There's a lot more income diversity. And still, we do have now in our community the population that moved there in the late 60s that now is elderly, and also a lot of those households are widowed households. So, one elderly person sort of in a single household. So that really truly affects the way that collective memory of the event is, right? And how that influences the emergency management for that particular community. And so, and that's just one of the communities. So that's very nuanced, and so having a general template type of preparedness strategy is not going to work in both contexts. Some of the strategies you talked about is education and media and school education programs. And doing that, the good time to do that is right after the disaster. So I have to tell you that I am currently involved talking about household preparedness. They prepare more when they have kids. Tomorrow, I'm actually with my undergraduate students. We are running a initiative on disaster risk reduction by Red Cross and Disney. And Red Cross and Disney got together and developed a project called Pillowcase. And the Pillowcase is where you go to schools, grades 3 to 5, or after school activities, and you talk to kids about hazards and how to prepare for those. And then you pick one that their area is particularly vulnerable to, and you do a little bit of a learning, sharing, practicing, and sharing. And the kids are supposed to take that program back to their households and talk to their households about it. And generally, it targets a few areas. It targets smoke detectors and installation in a home for domestic fires. It targets evacuations, knowing the house plans and exits, and the importance of evacuating a home within 2 minutes from the smoke alarm going off. And also some strategies for communications, having the plan, having your kid, and stuff like that. So research on kids and disasters typically focused on kids being victims of disasters and how they fare through it and after it. Issues with PTSD, emotional, psychological effects. But very little research, and it's really emerging, is on how kids can be agents in their households in talking to their parents, because those households that have kids are more likely to prepare. So we want to leverage that, and we want to make kids the agents of preparedness. Now, unfortunately, very few states, very few in a country, but very few states have mandatory emergency management education. And generally, it's not part of the curriculum. So this program is really good because it's off the shelf, it's paid for by Disney, it uses volunteers, it's very easy to deliver, and it really ties into that whole community approach where the kids learn about stuff and they go home and they talk to their parents. So that's one of the education initiatives. But again, it's a lot of effort, and it's a lot of putting it together, and it's a whole community approach, so to speak. Generally, you mentioned that the education programs are particularly good after the disaster happens, because that's when the public is listening. That also goes for policy, and there is research on policy making for that talks about how the best window for policy making is when you have a critical event, there is a public outcry because something went horribly wrong, aka you have disaster, because the social and institutional structures failed. And then you have media exposure, which is very, very strong. And then you also have research that can complement, and all those three strands meeting can create a window for policy making. Unfortunately, when we look at mitigation is always put at the end of the emergency management cycle, right? So when the media are gone, and when the people are not upset anymore, they moved on to do other things, that's when we start thinking about mitigation. And that's, generally too late, because you're missing this policy window. And case in point, after Deepwater Horizon, you all know about Katrina, but Deepwater Horizon happened 5 years later, and really battered already strained community, and the fisheries and the economic impact on the region was tremendous. But the big contentious issue in Deepwater Horizon was the use of a dispersant from the air to break down the globe floating on the surface of the water for 80 some days, which BP could not stomach that public image of their company being floated on the media. And so they used this dispersant, which later research suggests is very toxic. But at the time, we were saying that, if, it's like soap, so diluted with water, just breaks down that stuff and it's perfectly safe. research wasn't there yet to document that Corexit actually at those, for those chemicals and being released at the depths that they were released, that Corexit, when mixed with whatever stuff was on the surface, was actually extremely toxic. But that research didn't come in until about 2015. Now, after Deepwater Horizon, there was a bill to eliminate Corexit from the strategies for cleanups of chemical materials and go to, more of the mechanical measures, which is more of a precautionary principle that European industry uses. And that sort of went, and the bill was proposed to make the Nalco company, which produces that in Texas, it's a proprietary ownership product. And there was a bill to actually regulate that agency. But unfortunately, the research was too late. And so even though the media was on the event and there was a public outcry originally, when the research came out, it was that window was missed and that bill got stuck and went nowhere. So that gives you a complexity of a situation of mitigation, how we should think in terms of mitigation. It has to be the inherent part of a response and short-term recovery, and unfortunately it isn't. And it's very difficult to catch up with it later because people have moved on to those daily activities. Question number 2 had to deal with let me see. For some reason, I don't have many notes on it, so I moved to question number 3. Michael was talking about effects of the successful preparedness programs, or some other factors. You talked about risk perception being low in correlation with actual risk, particularly for people that feel that if they have experience, so you talked about experience with a particular hazard, so living close to the river, you think that the river and you can assess the river and you have dealt with river coming off its banks. And so the sense of risk perception is influenced by your experience and might be not necessarily scientifically based or predictive for new circumstances or new factors, and so you think that you're not vulnerable to flood. And I believe that somebody mentioned California, and you had a big discussion on that. It was Michael and Paulette and Kacey, so I can't quite figure out from my notes who were saying what, but you talked about the gist of it was that with risk perception, when the newcomers are moving into the area, the natives that had that indigenous or subculture of dealing with disaster minimize the risk because they see it through the different lens. They see it through their past experiences. So even if somebody was reading about the risks of earthquakes, XYZ increasing, or was apprehensive moving to this area, now that are under the social influence and social pressure, they are told or taught or acculturated to minimize that risk. So even though you might have some realistic risk assessments coming in through new community members, they get attenuated by the social influence, and you discussed social influence in the last Hangout as well. So that's very interesting, and you had a really good discussion on that, on social persuasion and downplaying of the risk, and neutralizing the fears that people might have that might be more realistic, or at least they are on that cautionary principle, and so. Kacey, I think you mentioned that people were saying, this is not my first rodeo. We've had many of them. You will get used to it, and don't worry about it. Denial. Jesse talked about denial playing a big role in risk perception or correct risk assessment, and Kacey, we have a reason for disasters. Certainly, I think when you talk about the shifts into anthropomorphic changes in the environment, we have moved. This is more on that. How the views on human suffering changed, and also the source of risk and source of disasters. We have moved on from that view of disasters being acts of God, and we're acknowledging more of them being the result of human activity. With that, I'm not really sure where your discussion went on the topic of increased onus on emergency management because of the less tolerance for human suffering and destruction we have today that we had when we viewed those disasters as purely the acts of God. So I think that's really important to keep in perspective. And you brought Drabek, which is really good, because Drabek says there are no disasters. Disaster is a social construct. Disaster is what happens when people do certain things. All disasters are social. Disasters happen when people live in a wrong area, when they don't have money, when the officials are not educated, when the agencies are not talking to one another. That's a disaster. The source, the agent, the actual reason for it is also in human activity. So those are those anthropomorphic changes. So because of those shifts in perception, now we know we contribute to disasters. Social expectations are much higher to minimize risk. And there's a lot more pressure and a lot more onus on formal emergency management structures for which, a lot of money is being spent for managing risk. And with that, goes managing expectations. So expectations are higher, now you have to manage higher expectations, and there's less tolerance for lives lost, and there's less tolerance for damages. And so from the aspect of individual preparedness and community preparedness, there's also that shift on, the feeling that we have those lack of good policies, lack of good legislations, lack of good regulations. That needs not happen, and we expect the government and public officials and emergency management to fix those things. So that's might be one of those ancillary factors where people don't feel that they should be preparing, where they were put in those situations by the building codes, by the land use, by the lack of mitigation, sound mitigation practices. They were put in those vulnerable environments every day where they live. And that's certainly a really, really valid point. So the next question, number 4 on Australia, and the video on a community disaster resilience, that was the one that Jackson was responsible for. So Jesse attacked that for him. And I think one of the major takeaways for Jackson was that the major issue with promoting community disaster resilience is when you are promoting it through the use of structures that are paramilitary. And those agencies tend to think that they have a capital on knowledge about the threats and hazards and risks, and they take that stand, the top-down approach of telling the communities or telling the people what to do to prepare and how to prepare, and being very normative in their approach, whereas generally, the opposite is really needed. It's grassroots efforts that are the best. It's the local efforts that are the most efficient. And, something that we didn't discuss in the class yet, but there's quite a lot of emerging research on how formal emergency management structures stifle indigenous knowledge, stifle indigenous experiences, how technology and science and technology has stifled certain coping mechanisms for communities that dealt with those disasters for years. So it's another side of a coin. The certain knowledge of what works, or certain wisdom that was tribal or societal, may be disappearing because people now have technology, or have reliance on technology, or have reliance on those emergency management structures and expectations that they will take care of that for them. So unintended consequences of rural expansion of emergency management processes can also erode indigenous or local knowledge and wisdom. And so the important thing is the fusion of the two. And I think the Australian video, tried to place on that certainly, you need both to talk to one another. So those efforts are going to be local. So those organizations have to accept those grassroots efforts and nuances. I think Jackson also talked about one of the issues in community disaster resilience building is the changing demographics of communities. And again, this is really true. I just talked about that. But you have people coming in that are that are bringing different knowledge and different culture and different language and different habits, and they might be different socioeconomic status. And so for emergency managers, they need to be acutely aware in how their deep community looks like, who is where, and, is there bonding, is there bridging, are there linkages, and what are the pockets of those communities that have particular needs and what nuances need to be addressed. So paramilitary style, certainly very structured bureaucratic organizations have very big difficulty with that because they work on standard operating procedures. So Jackson, again, I think, and Jesse, you talked about working relationships with the community, soliciting feedback. Why not have the community contribute to emergency management? Emergency management is not the unique expertise of just emergency management coordinators or first responders. It's a collective knowledge of a community meeting formal organizational structures. And Jesse was on board with that, not to disenfranchise the local tribal knowledge, because and I will give you an example. Another example also happened in Harvey. American Red Cross, who I will defend very strongly because it is one of the most legacy organizations, NGOs, with a very, very long tradition of alleviating human suffering, very humanitarian, and really does a lot more things than disasters. But American Red Cross failed in Harvey in the first 3 days of Harvey. They were not being effective and they were not being efficient, mostly because they have regionalized over the years. And so when you are thinking about the case of Cockrell, where you read an article in North Carolina about the Red Cross and pandemic flu, if you recall that, and there were, they had a footprint in that community. Now think about, do you see Red Cross in your community? They've lost that footprint because they have regionalized. So for Houston and for Harvey, are part of a region, and so there were people that were brought in for communications, for decision making, for coordination, and for all those processes during Harvey that came from, Rio Grande Valley and places like that. And they were not from local communities. For us, local volunteers from American Red Cross, we were not integrated in a response because the volunteer connection technology failed and collapsed. And so because you don't self-dispatch, right, you were sort of immobilized in that. So that shows you how, that organization with really, really long legacy lost that footprint in the local community, in a truly local community. If you have a driver that comes and brings meals, to the shelter, and that driver has never been in that area, that's a volunteer from, somewhere, Lubbock or somewhere, then that person doesn't have, doesn't know where to go if that road gets cut off. I know exactly how to get to my community from every and whichever way it is. Even if there is an illegal passage somewhere, I can unstrap and do it, but somebody that's external to the event won't be able to do it. So again, that local is very important. And a lot of the community organizations, are they truly community organizations, or have they regionalized? And I think that's an issue as well. Paulette was talking about the importance of those community needs, because community is the only one that can determine what is good for it. because there is no size fits all, right, in approaches for to disaster management with various demographics. Um, Paulette, I think, took on the community disaster resilience from the standpoint of comparative challenges between the US and Australia and what are some similar pictures. One was, again, going back to Jackson's argument on paramilitary structures and homeland security and emergency management specifically. And certainly, incident command system came from the military. Now, came from the fire services, but fire services adopted it from the military. And actually, you will have really interesting, hopefully, conversations on that this week on incident command system, but in other standard operating procedures. When they meet chaotic dynamic environments, they are bound to break. And so that's one that sort of putting a very bureaucratic, structured paramilitary formal organization on the community that is very nuanced, that differs from place to place, and also on contexts that are evolving, dynamic, and emergent, and very complex, and with high levels of unpredictability. As far as so the paramilitary would be one similarity. The other one would be uncertainty, increasing uncertainty about events such as environmental issues, ecology, and sort of some inability to give very tangible solutions for the future. We tend to look for outcome. We tend to look for solution. If we're to prepare, I want to know what I'm supposed to do, what I'm supposed to buy. But if you cannot give me that direction, if you can't even tell me what resiliency is, because it means different things to different people, then it's really, really hard to get the engagement and buy-in. And that would be a common challenge in the United States and Australia, and you had a good discussion around that. The next question dealt with whether you think that the focus of emergency management as of late, particularly post 9/11, has been mostly on critical infrastructure versus on societal resilience and ecological resilience. And I think you all agree that yes, that there we tend to focus on things. Well, first of all, physical structures are easy to measure: height, width, how many windows, how many doors, and how much money is it going to cost if this thing needs to be rebuilt, or how much money is it going to cost if this thing is not functional for several days. So it's easy to assess losses or consequences. So when you look at the risk matrix, and you've taken classes on critical infrastructure protection and also on risk assessments, you can use the rubric to assess risk of that building being out of commission for 5 days for that particular industry. It's a little bit more tricky with community resilience, right? First of all, it's hard to define it. There are different models. And second, you've got psychological aspects and you have social aspects. And if you don't have life loss, which is, the measure of consequence, right? Or measure for risk, you would have money lost or lives lost. And then what else do you use for ecology or societal? Do you look at, how do you look at psychological impacts, dread, fear, depression? All those are a lot more difficult. How do you look at the impact of the community being different demographically after a disaster? This is an open discussion on gentrification, on social changes in a community, in certain phases of the recovery. If you have not read on gentrification, it's a very interesting aspect of emergency management as well. And that has more of a community aspect. What if the symbols are gone from the area? What if you don't have those really wonderful post oaks in Galveston anymore because they get killed by salty water during Ike, and you lose that symbolic, or your building is now you build differently, I don't know if I shared with you an example of very, very failed initiative in New Orleans post Katrina, where tons of money was dedicated to research for model homes that would be more resistant to flooding, or they would actually be floating homes and so on and so forth. Some Japanese company had a bid on that. And the people that designed this new architecture didn't take into account the community and the social expectations and the attachment of people in New Orleans to those shotgun homes, right, with the wrapping around porches. It's part of their life, it's part of the culture, it's part of how they socialize, it's part of how they grow up, how the kids grow up. So, bringing you something really futuristic designed in Japan, it's just not really going to appeal to the community. And they're not going to purchase those, and they're not going to be willing to buy into those. So those are sort of some of the considerations. And talking about, looking at physical infrastructure, but not really looking at that deeper community values, grassroots expectations, nuances of a community. I think Kacey talked about the Army Corps of Engineers decision about the dam in Missouri and focusing on infrastructure versus focusing on the ecological and environmental impacts, and how it would ruin the ecosystem, lead to affecting the ecosystem. It still shows our predominant focus is on critical infrastructure. So the last question, I think, was about the change agents, or what type of person do you want to make sure that preparedness mission, or that they address preparedness strategies in a way that is going to be more effective than it has been thus far, and how would you test those competencies? And so you talked about capacity to resolve conflict. So the new emergency management professionals have to be able to be mediators. They have to have evidence of actually being in and working in those environments, like, have you done volunteering? Someone, do they have a volunteer, like for homeowners associations, do they have attachment to the community? I think Jesse mentioned 5 strategies to reduce injury and death, or for planning. So I think that as far as change agents, you were just sort of talked about more challenges, like in gated communities and stuff like that. How do you know your community? I go back to the definition of community. There's so many different definitions. How do you define community? Do you really know your community where you are? And let's start with that. And what do you do at that community yourself? And when you ask yourself that question, and then when you answer it, then it's going to give you and you're probably a pretty engaged individual. You're pretty involved in a lot of things, but when you look at what you do for your community, that gives you the scope of a challenge that it might be for others that are already marginalized or not very engaged. Jesse moved in to look at those strategies listed in DRABIC and defining the system's purpose, like, breaking down what agencies are responsible for what in that preparedness effort. Have a core strategy that at the same time is flexible, multiple briefings with different agencies, so bringing everybody to the table, collaborative decision making, thinking with customers in mind, that the customers have to be authors of the plan. I heard a statement in my research on Harvey that community is the most bastardized word in the emergency management and sociology discourse, because we talk about communities, but they are very rarely represented in those decision-making processes. So certainly they should be the authors of the plan. I really like that. And cultural awareness. cultural awareness would be, and I would think that that's a prerequisite of a 21st century emergency management professional. Diagnosing the cultural issues, being, and that requires somebody that is not just an experienced practitioner, because that knowledge doesn't necessarily comes through experience. It also comes through professional development, leadership development, and knowledge, and actually, getting educated. It's very interesting to me sometimes to meet emergency management professionals that don't have solid background in emergency management practices or structures or history, or stuff that you are doing, and so they base their experiences based on what they have experienced solely. So you lack this really large knowledge base, or domain knowledge. So experience is not always sufficient, particularly if it's an experience that hasn't been reflected upon. So the emergency managers in the future, I hope that education is going to be equally important to experience. When you think about risk assessments, a modeling of weather, or predicting where the plume of toxic material is going to go to and how it's going to affect ecosystem, you're going to have people working with you that are going to be meteorologists, that are going to be experts in measuring those impacts, or at least they're going to know where to look for sources to research those topics. So that's all I've got for you. I enjoyed your presentation. I really commend Kacey for dealing with babysitting while studying and getting involved in discussion. So your daughter was truly a trooper. She was even trying to give you some answers, I think, during some part of a presentation. So thank you for that, and thank you for taking the responsibility for Jackson and helping him out on that one. And I will see you on the last one.